Hello and welcome to another episode of Rustacean Station. I'm your host, Alan Wyma. Today I'm with Joshua Nelson, the team of Bootstrap. Sorry, I got the name a little bit wrong. Maybe you could introduce yourself so I don't butcher it anymore. Do you mind to go ahead?
Sure, yeah. So I'm the team lead of the Bootstrap team, which is like the tool that builds the compiler itself. It actually just recently got started, I think last week. I formally made the team. So no worries if you haven't heard about it yet. It's still very...
There's so many teams within Rust. I mean, do you think there's like 30 or 100 or what? I mean, there's a lot.
Yeah, so it's the governance setup is interesting. There's like the top level teams, which is like compiler, language, libs, things like that. And then there's sub teams, and then there's working groups, and then there's project groups. And I think there's significantly more working groups and project groups than anything else. But they also tend to be a lot smaller and shorter lived than the other teams.
Yeah, and there's a lot of like groups that I think I've seen some groups. It's like they're trying to be, I forgot the names, but it seemed more like social groups rather than actual technical groups. It's like trying to make sure that people get onboarded properly or something like that. The names I can't remember now, but I felt like some of the groups,
I think the Rust C Dev Guide working group, maybe?
maybe not. I'm sorry, I'm just kind of speaking out of my, half awake brain at the moment, but I could have sworn I saw some that were like, okay, it's not like it's a bad group to have. It's just like, okay, I never thought about that, but I can see how that could be useful. Like that was my thought when I heard about it. So what was the change that led to having this group created all of a sudden?
Yeah. So the Bootstrap tool hadn't seen a lot of work for a long time. So a little bit about Bootstrap to explain the history. The Rust compiler is written in Rust, which means that I can't use cargo, and it also existed before cargo existed because the compiler was the first thing to be written in Rust. And so originally it used make files, and then like 5 or 8 years ago, we switched it over to a Rust build tool. I think Alex Crichton was the one to do that originally. And then Mark Ruskov, he goes by Simulacrum, maintained it for a while. And he maintains a lot of things. He's also on the release team, and he reviews libs PRs and all sorts of things. And so as a result, it wasn't like seeing a lot of active development for a while. And then around 2021, I started working on it more actively. And so we kind of formed the team, so that I could, have permissions to approve and review PRs and that sort of thing, but also because I wanted to recruit more people to the team and be able to onboard them.
Why is it that we actually need to create a team just for this? Couldn't it just be like a call for action and people kind of work on it? But I guess that would mean that the activity would go down after a while, right?
So there's two reasons I wanted it to be a team. One is that it gives people a sense of ownership. If we say you're on the Bootstrap team, then they have like, I don't know, kind of a sense that they're involved and they're kind of a full-fledged member of the team instead of, they contribute a PR and then wander off. And the other half of it is teams are how we control permission. So if people are on the Bootstrap team, then they're allowed to approve PRs, they're allowed to performance testing. We have like a bot that will run it in the cloud, that sort of thing. And so they have like more abilities that they wouldn't have if they were just like any contributor on GitHub.
Now, this kind of team, is it really like a full-fledged team or is it like a sub-team of a
It's a
bigger team?
sub-team
It's a
of
sub-team.
infrastructure.
Okay. Do you mind to kind of talk about that kind of team structure real quick? Because to me, I'm not too sure before if it was like all flat or like you said, it seems more like tree structure where like you said, you have infrastructure team and within you have sub teams. Do you mind to talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So this is not without precedent. If you look at, for example, the DevTools team, there's like one top level DevTools team, which doesn't have a ton of responsibilities. And then there's a lot of sub teams like Rustdoc, Rust Format, Rustdoc. All of those are members of the DevTools team. And like those sub teams are like where most people are involved and are members. And that's kind of what happened here is we have infrastructure at the top level and then Bootstrap as a sub team. And the main reason for that is that infrastructure has a lot of special permissions that even other teams in the organization don't have. And so we wanted to like separate out, people who have access to the 1Password, for instance, from people who are contributing to Rust playing Rust.
Wait. I didn't know there's some teams that have special permissions rather than others, right? That seems a little bit unfair, but I guess there must be a good reason for that.
Well, the reason is other teams don't need those permissions, right? So one of the things infrastructure does that makes it unique is it's in charge of the distribution artifact. So when you install something with Rustdoc or you download the standalone installer, that's downloading artifacts from static.rustlang.org, that website. And infrastructure is actually the only team that has permissions to upload or delete artifacts from that website. And there's just no need for other teams to have that permission because they don't use it day to day.
That part always wonder about how, like, big corporates and I guess teams there should be similar, how they can share, like, permissions and passwords and all this kinda stuff between each other. Is that okay to talk about that, or is that a secret of the
It's not
infrastructure
a
team?
secret. No, there's a shared one password that only a select few people have access to. And that controls, there's like a Rustlang owner account that's in charge of all the GitHub organizations. There's like a Twitter account that has a password in there, things like that. There's a signing key for the distributed artifacts, that sort of thing.
Now, is there some kind of, like, audit log? So if somebody accesses it or if they're gonna do something, they have to kinda let people know, "Hey, this is gonna happen, so be aware and don't think we've been hacked," or something like that?
I think so. So I'm not actually on the part of the infrastructure team that has access to the one password, but I've seen people leave messages like, "Hey, if you saw an access to the one password, that was me." So presumably there's an audit log. Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, with such a huge product, so many eyes on it, even, the haters or whatever, the C++ people are also looking to see what's going on in Rust. Or just you kinda worry about, should I, like, make this announcement, and is this okay? And I'm also kinda curious about how do you know when you should tweet and when you shouldn't tweet? And
Yeah, so that was a big thing recently this past week. There were the two papers about safety submitted to Working Group 21. I think Bjarne Straussup was involved in both of them. And they were explicitly about like the NSA and Consumer Reports and all these people have started saying C and C++ are memory unsafe and you should avoid them in new code. And of course, the C++ committee was very worried about this because they have a lot of people who are considering switching away from C++ now. It was kind of a hard decision, like, do I advertise that? Do I let people know about it? It does seem important, but I don't want like the appearance of punching down, of like loading about, I don't know, people switching over.
yeah, but I could see it both ways, right? You don't want to bash other people, but at the same time, you do wanna promote stuff. And actually promoting memory safe languages has been a big trend recently for the past, I don't know, couple of years, I think, at least a couple of years, maybe even 5 or so years. That's why I find it a little bit, yeah. I mean, first of all, yeah, everybody knows that C and C++ are like they're like katanas. They're very good, very precise, but at the same time, it's like katana without a handle. So
Right,
if you squeeze too tight in combat, you're gonna cut yourself, if that
right.
makes sense.
Effective but dangerous.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, I don't know why they would be upset. It's a well-known thing, but I mean, I know why they'd be upset, but that's just the way it is. And you're never gonna get rid of C, C++. We've been talking about Java dying for the past 20 years, but I don't think it's dead yet.
Right, right. Yeah, C++ is going to be around for a while, even if people aren't writing new code in it.
Yeah, exactly. You can't throw the stuff away. So, but that was never tweeted out, I think, because I don't think I remember seeing it. But I did see that Steve Klabnik tweeted it out. That's how I knew what you were talking about, that article.
Yeah, Steve Klabnik is very involved with all the Twitter stuff and like involvement from other communities and that sort of thing. Yeah, I try to avoid hacker news. Don't really enjoy the discussions there, and so I kind of stay away from it.
Okay. Yeah. I never look at Hacker News, but it is interesting to see that there's studies being done. And I think I remember a long time ago, like my long time ago could be yesterday, a couple weeks ago, like NSA did, or no, even a couple months ago, the NSA did say, oh, yeah, you should not be using those things. You should be using memory safe. But I don't think they may not have specifically said Rust. I think
I
they were
think they
being
had a
very,
whole laundry list of languages. They
oh, did
had
they?
like Python, Ruby, Go, Java, and I think Rust might have been in there, but they weren't singling out Rust. No,
Yeah, that's what I remember. So they weren't like picking out anybody in particular. I
right.
always still find it kind of a little bit scary, like if some of these tools, these hacker tools, start to use Rust. But I've seen that already start happening, not as quickly as I thought.
Yeah, so this is really interesting. I saw something the other day. I've forgotten exactly what it was. I think something to do with like stack unwinding or debug symbols. A lot of the antivirus tools are not able to recognize malware that's written in Rust because it's like in an unfamiliar binary format. And so the tools for using it for detecting it are actually not as good. So in a way is an advantage to hackers too, at least until the antivirus vendors catch up.
Oh yeah, it's always cat and mouse game between the antivirus and the virus creators, right?
Right. And then there's the other side of it, which is that the reverse engineering tools for it aren't quite as good yet. A lot of the demanglers like GDB and LLDB are not quite good at demangling the symbols yet. So there's that side of it too.
Okay.
Which hurts to the Rust debugging experience as well. I mean, it's not just limited to people doing security research. If you're doing, using GDB to debug your own program, it affects you too. I think we do have a working group for improving the debugging experience, but I'm not sure how active it is.
What we did bring on here to talk about, I don't want to drift too far away from the topic of course, we both love to talk about all this kind of stuff, is about we brought you on to talk about the Rust docs, right? You know, it's funny because documentation is, how do I say, it's something that every developer wants, but no developer wants to make
Right.
for many different reasons. I think one of the big ones is like, well, we're always adding new features and fixing bugs, so it's just going to change, and I don't want to keep updating it. But at the same time, it's like one of the things that they judge libraries on is, oh, there's no documentation. This is bad. This library is horrible. Something like that. Maybe that's too extreme of how they would say it, but they do say, oh, this is a concern, right? I think it's like, okay, when's the last update? Who's the individual who wrote it? And is there documentation? I think are like the top three.
Right. Yeah, it's always a hard trade-off between like, do you make the documentation more detailed so that people understand it better, or do you make it, but like at the same time, the more you do that, the more likely it is to get out of date. And I think that's why it's so important that Rustdoc auto-generates so much of the documentation, because it means you can get pretty high-quality docs even without spending a lot of time the internals, because it'll do all that for you. It'll automatically update whenever your code updates. And actually, a lot of the features I worked on were related to that, on giving you warnings if you like. So the main feature I worked on for Rustdoc was introdoc links, the feature where you like have a bracket and you put in the name of some type in your code, and it'll automatically generate an HTML link based on just the name. And one of the things I really like about that is if you typo the name or if it changes in the code, then you automatically get a warning that the link is broken so that you know to update it. And so you have less problem with bit rot and with changing requirements because you'll know when the link changes when you need to update it.
Yeah, that's extremely useful. I do remember the intro library links. I thought that was a really awesome feature because it's annoying to have to like, oh, this one, and then figure out which crate maybe, and then try to find it and try to find the link and everything. And yeah, it does work pretty seamlessly. So that's an awesome feature. Thanks for adding that in.
I'm really glad to hear that. Yeah, I spent a lot of time working out the bugs throughout 2020 mostly and a bit of 2021.
Yeah, I do love the docs. I mean, the other thing that's really nice too is like because Rust is a typed language, you also do get kind of that kind of doc, right? If you name your types pretty, it's easy to understand what's going on. But yeah, sometimes you do need to fill out all the documentation for that. I think Rust also has like the checking, so if you do write some code, it verifies that it's correct when you write like some sample code within your documentation, or am I
Yes,
wrong?
doc tests. Yes.
Yeah, the
So you
doc
can
test. Okay.
have,
Because there's another language I use all the time that has doc tests, and I wanted to make sure because I remember this, but I wanted to make sure I didn't say the wrong thing. So the doc tests are awesome.
yeah, I'm glad they're useful. They're kind of a hack. We like spawn a new well, first we like start a new parse session within the compiler, and then we spawn a new compiler process to create a binary for it. And then people want to do things that we're not flexible enough to do, like they want to be able to compile and run the doc tests separately in different commands. That's its own whole thing. But yeah, they are quite useful. Yeah, it's a feature I'm glad we have.
Yeah, and I'm happy that you worked on this stuff because well, that's actually one of the also one of I think the top three things that people say when they come to Rust is the documentation is awesome, right?
That's great.
Yeah, that's for sure. I mean, I'm sure you've seen that quite a few times already, no?
It's funny, when I was on the Rustdoc team, I mostly saw bug reports.
Mm.
I did once in a while see, Rustdoc is great, I love it. But the bug reports were a lot more common.
I think there should be. I don't think there is a saying, but there should be a saying that like when you hear complaints and you know you're doing a good job. I think there's a
Right.
similar saying that like if nobody's complaining to you, then what you're doing maybe is futile. But if
I
you don't
think
have
that
people
comes out of C++,
complaining, yeah,
actually. There's two types of languages. Languages that nobody uses and languages that people complain.
yeah. So if people complain and they complain very loudly, it's like okay, at least I'm doing something right.
Right.
Yeah.
It's useful enough that lots of people are trying to use it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, but you're not still on the Rust Docs team, or are you?
No, I left the Rustdoc team January of 2022.
Oh, okay. So, oh, sorry, that's 1 year ago. Okay, but you joined. You said in obviously before 22, but before 20, I think, right?
Yeah, so I've had kind of an interesting
Why
history
don't
with
we talk about your history and how you got into it and how you
yeah.
got to this? That'd be easier to understand the whole
Yeah,
history.
yeah, yeah. So the way I got into the language in the first place, the way I started writing code, is I took a compiler's course in college with a professor I really liked, and a friend of mine gave a talk on Rust at just like a computing club at the university. And over the following summer, I had a lot of free time. I was like, oh, let me try and write a compiler. And at first, I tried doing it in Haskell, and that did not go well. I was like trying to use print statements from deep in the program, and Haskell is pure, so you can't do that. And so I gave up and I started rewriting it in Rust instead, and that went a lot better. And at the time, I was using CraneLift, which is a code generation library, kind of like LLVM, and it was changing super rapidly. CraneLift is a library used by Fastly, which was like kind of a younger company at the time. And so I was like constantly going on docs.rs to look up the new documentation for what had changed in the newest version. And I was running into all these bugs on docs.rs, and I was like, okay, let me go and fix these bugs. And it turns out that at the time, docs.rs didn't really have any maintainers. And so to get, my small bug fix merged, I ended up like rewriting half the deploy scripts and making it possible to run the site locally because it wasn't at the time. And I ended up on the docs.rs team, and it was just this whole thing. And from there, docs.rs and Rustdoc sound the same and do a lot of the same things. And so we get a lot of bug reports for one that are intended for the other. And I was like, okay, well, let me go look into these Rustdoc issues that people keep complaining about. And that's how I ended up doing more of the Rustdoc work.
Okay. And you stayed on that team for quite some time. Why did you leave the team? Is it because you feel like you've done enough work there, or what was the thought process?
Yeah, I was feeling kind of overworked and burned out at the start of 2022. I think a 3 or 4 month break where I just wasn't doing any open source Rust at all. And that was helpful for me.
Sorry, I am just kind of curious about like the overwork. Is it just like the amount of bugs coming in and maybe your dedication to getting everything done?
Kind of. I also had a full time job at the same time, and I was not balancing the two very well. It was my first job out of college. The transition was a little hard for me,
Okay.
but there was that. And I was also doing a lot of things in the Rust community at the time that I took a break. I was on Rustdoc, I was on the Rusty Dev Guide team, I was attending the compiler meetings that are every week. There's a lot of things.
Yeah, I can understand. I think you and I are a little bit similar. It's like we want to do a lot of stuff and then you get burnt out and also you take a lot of things to heart. It's like, oh, somebody has a bug and you're like, oh, that's really a big bug. I got to fix this like as soon as possible. And it
Right,
becomes exhausting.
right. Yeah, that was definitely a big part of it.
Yeah, that's why I'm actually kind of a little bit of a small break. I cut one of the big things out of my schedule this time and I'm like, I feel already so much better. But I think I'm off work maybe 1 or 2 hours earlier, but still like 3 hours later than I should be. But at
Yeah.
least I feel better. So I guess if you're usually at 10x and then now you go down to 8x, it's like, okay, well, not as good as I wanted to be, but I
It's
can
an
do this.
improvement. Yeah.
Yeah, improvement is definitely it.
Yeah.
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, people say the point to you for about the documentation, right? Like, how does the documentation kind of work in terms of prioritizing features and things like that when you were on the part of the team?
Yeah, so Rustdoc was interesting because we didn't have regular meetings or roadmap or anything like that. A lot of the time on the team, I spent paying down technical debt. So in 2021, especially when I first joined, Rustdoc was in kind of a rough position. It was a very small team, and it was a lot of features that had been added kind of ad hoc. People on the compiler team or people with like a pet feature would add something one off and then wander away and never maintain it again. And so we had like this giant pile of features, but the code itself was hard to work with and reason about. And the other thing that made it hard was you had to build the entire Rust compiler first before you can even like start working on Rustdoc. The compile times for that made it pretty hard to get started as well. So I worked on trying to pay down some of that technical debt to make the code easier to understand and reason about, and also on the build time. So one of the big victories I'm really happy about is I made it so you don't have to build the compiler before building Rustdoc. You can just download those precompiled artifacts from CI and then build Rustdoc itself. And that took the compile times from like 30 to 40 minutes to 60 seconds. So it was a giant improvement.
These precompiled, like what kind of artifacts are these that are being precompiled then?
Yeah, so the compilation model for Rust is you have your final binary, and then you have intermediate artifacts, which are called rlibs, which are, if you work with linkers, it's basically a .ar archive, but like with some extra metadata. And so the things that we're downloading are the rlibs, so the intermediate area artifacts. So just like you have a dependency when you use cargo, you have log or Tokyo or whatever in your code. The thing that cargo is building when it builds that dependency is an rlib. And so that's what we were downloading.
Oh, okay. I see. I guess an rlib short for Rust library,
Yes, that sounds right.
something like that. Okay, makes some sense. Now, when you're working on these features for the docs, right, and you have all this tech debt, right? The tech debt, do you know, like, was it because people were trying to rush to like bolt on features, or like where did this tech debt come from?
Rustdoc is an old tool. It's older than Clippy, it's older than Rust format. It's actually the second version of Rustdoc. It's a rewrite of an even earlier version. I think the rewrite was done around 2011. And the original maintainer left the project 10 years ago. A lot of the intermediary maintainers had left the project in that time. And so there wasn't a lot of institutional knowledge on how it worked. And so when features were added, it was kind of done ad hoc, and like each feature was unique and did things in a different way. So understanding one didn't necessarily help you understand the others. The other thing that it did that made it hard to understand is it had its own AST. So the abstract syntax tree is how the compiler represents your code in memory. And at the time that I joined, the Rust compiler and Rustdoc had two different ones that were incompatible. And it like had this whole giant pass where it converted the one to the other in ways that were hard to understand. And I spent a lot of time trying to get them more similar to one another so that people who understood the compiler would also be able to understand Rustdoc and be able to contribute.
Do you know why they were different? Is it because there's just different needs, and then you found out that it'd be easier to make them more similar?
In 2011, when Rustdoc was first written, the AST was changing a lot more rapidly. So having the separate AST for Rustdoc made it so that it was easier to change the compiler's AST without spending as much time maintaining Rustdoc. But it's not changing as rapidly anymore, so it doesn't make as much sense for them to be separate.
Okay, yeah, I'm just trying to. I mean, I know what is AST, but I'm not too sure about how different things can be necessarily between the two. I mean, so does this involve like talking to another team to kind of try to sync up and say, okay, what is this thing, and can we converge on this?
I'm glad you mentioned that. So one of the things that blocked introdoc links for a long time was a lack of communication between Rustdoc and the other teams. We were the existing maintainers were under the impression that like there was a giant new feature that needed to be added to the compiler in order for us to support links between crates. And it turns out that there wasn't. That work had just already been done 3 years ago, but we didn't know about it. And so that I ended up like digging into the code and like reconstructing from the code that the feature existed in the compiler already because I didn't know who to ask. There wasn't that line of communication between the teams.
Yeah, that's the thing that I always find so hard to understand because Rust is. I mean, Rust is not the only one, right? Linux is also a super big example of this. Is like there's so many teams, so many
Mhm.
people, so much code from years. How do you guys like understand where to go and what to do and what is what and all this kind of stuff? Because yeah, I mean, I don't think there's like no central like. I mean, is there a central like directory or God book that lets you know, okay, if I need this, I go to this person?
Kind of. There's a team repository that has a list of like who's on what team. But, T-compiler is pretty big. Someone who's an expert in code gen won't necessarily be an expert in how macros are expanded, for example. So that gives you like some idea of where to look. At one point we had an experts map, but I don't think it's been maintained in several years. So yeah, it's definitely hard to know. You have to like ask around on Zulip and watch what people review and that sort of thing. It's not trivial. I do want to make this easier. One of the initiatives I was working on in November of last year was to start a project management working group. But that had a lot of interactions with like Rust governance and that sort of thing, which we're hoping to make progress on soon. So I'm waiting until we have that a little more settled before working more on project management.
This question came to mind, and maybe it's a little bit sensitive, but I was curious about if you do have like mass resignation of a group, like what happened with moderation group. I mean, is I don't know. Like, I'm just curious how the heck Russ can handle something like that because that's. 1 or 2 people leaving, okay, you can replace them, but it's like a whole group, it's like, "Oh my god, what do
Yeah.
we do now?"
Yeah. I've heard it described as Rust is in a constitutional crisis and has been since the mod team left. The core team and the top level teams published a blog post shortly after that happened, talking about how they're like forming a group to try and work through governance issues and make it so this doesn't happen again. And I know a little bit about that. That's not public, sorry. But I
Sure.
do know that they're actively working on it and trying to improve the situation.
No, I understand. It's not easy when you have so many people, different ideas and everything, it's hard to keep the ship ahead. That's why it's like, if you don't have, like, that dictator, sometimes it becomes harder, right? Like, yeah, I don't know, I mean, people often compare it's like, okay, look at, like, democratic countries and how little bit nuts they can be, like, but at the same time, it's like, well, there's positive and negatives for everything. You cannot have everything. There's no silver bullet, as they say, right? There's no, like, grand
Right.
thing.
Yeah, one of the hardest things in the immediate like aftermath of the mod team leaving is it was hard to know like who should be part of the group because inviting the top level teams excluded a lot of people who were very active in the project. So it's like, how do you make that decision, right? Where do you say the cutoff is? So we kind of picked top levels like an approximation for people who have a lot of trust, but it definitely wasn't a perfect approximation. And that's one of the things that governance team is trying to work on.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know who you would kind of bring your grievances to if you have some issue. Like I said, that's the governance team, right?
Kind of. I can't talk about it too much until it's public. Sorry. In the past, before the mod team resigned, there was the core team and
Okay.
there was the moderation team, and you would bring grievances to the moderation team. But the core team was the one that was technically in charge, and so the disagreement between the two is why this was so complicated.
Oh, I see.
Because there was agreements with the core team itself.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, I think I remember that part. Yeah. I'm still trying to get there's so many teams. I feel like it's teams and protocols are similar where people say it's no perfect one. So, okay, I'm going to create the perfect protocol that's going to beat all other protocols. Now you just have another standard to deal with.
Right. Yeah, it's hard. Maintaining trust, I think, it was the hardest thing. The reason the old mod team resigned, I think, was because of a lack of trust more than any specific
Yeah.
decision.
It always relates to people problems. As far as I know, nobody's quitting due to some technical issue that's never going to get fixed. It's just like, oh, I'm not happy because of, you know, something with some other people. It's like, okay,
Yeah.
yeah, I hope all this stuff gets settled up. I feel like these kind of things are being blown up because people are looking for ways to say, oh, look at, Russ is not that great, you see? Or they got problems like with this. It's like, well, everybody's got that. Maybe people are just blown up a little bit more than what it should be.
Right. I will say, of the large organizations I've worked in, I think Rust is in pretty good shape. I know the people who are working in governance right now, and I trust them a lot.
Well, that's good. I mean, I think the trust is the hard part, right?
Right.
When you work with another team for the first time, right? Are you just a little bit worried? Because I mean, I'm not asking to name anybody, but I'm sure there must be some teams that you maybe are not the most excited to work with because of working with them maybe is not easy compared to some other teams, right?
Yes. Yes, I would agree with that.
Yeah. So I mean, when you work with a new team, I'm just kind of curious about how you would approach it. You just kind of find somebody on Zoom and like, hey, how are you?
I don't have too much trouble with new teams, actually. I've been in the project long enough that I kind of know who's in charge of each team. And much more common than like not wanting to work with the team is they'll just be understaffed. Like the DevTools teams, especially Rust format, Rustdoc, don't have a lot of maintainers. And that's, in my experience, been more of an issue than like people who are hard to work.
Oh, really? Have you ever had a situation where you need something from a team and then like they don't have enough staff and then you just kind of help to chip in?
Yeah, this happened a lot with RLS before Rust Analyzer became the official language server. Is they had one maintainer who didn't have a lot of time and was like constantly swamped. So for mostly technical reasons, there was so the way RLS was maintained in Tree was as what's called a Git submodule, which means that it's basically just like a pointer to another repository, and it says this commit on this repository is like what belongs in this tree. But that didn't work out super well for RLS because it depended on compiler internals. And so anytime you make a breaking change to the compiler, like even to the internal representation, you also break RLS and it won't be available until you fix RLS, and you can't fix them at the same time because it's a submodule. You can only change it in that separate repository, and you can only change that separate repository after you've merged your raking change. So in the gap between those two, RLS and I think Rust format had this problem too, will just be unavailable on nightly until you fix it. And so the maintainer of RLS was just spending all his time constantly fixing breakage instead of, making performance improvements or working on features, just because he didn't have the time. There was so much work running in place to keep up.
Now, I mean, if you're from one team and helping on another team, is there like a formal process where you have to say, okay, I would like to help you with this? Or, I mean, you must at least like reach out and say, hey, I see you're busy. This is kind of important to me. I'm willing to help on this. Are you okay? You need to kind of do some checking, right?
Yeah, it's just like any other contributor, really. I mean, you have a little bit of influence if you're on another team, but it's really only T release has that final say of like, hey, we actually need this to happen, and anyone else is just like, someone who the team lead might know, but aren't necessarily getting like deferred to, if that makes sense.
Wait, did you just say that if I understood correctly, what you're saying is that you needed to reach out to another team in between to
No, no,
confirm?
no, no, no. Okay, so
Okay,
there's
maybe I misunderstood. Sorry.
no, no, you're fine. Say that I'm on the Rustdoc team and I run into some bug in my code and I'm like, oh, a Clippy lint could have caught this. I can go to the Clippy team and be like, and file an issue and say, hey, I want this new lint. And they may or may not work on it. They're not necessarily giving me special deference just because I happen to be in the organization. But say that, Clippy or Rust format isn't available on nightly for 3 weeks and the release is coming up tomorrow. Someone from the release team can go to Rust format and be like, hey, we need this change in order to ship Rust format. If you have time, please do this. If not, we're going to do this because we need to ship the release. And that's really the only time when like someone would like really have to like defer to someone else because we need to ship releases. It's not
Yeah.
optional.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
I don't think it ever gets anything higher up than that. Like nobody would say, "No, this is not coming into our project."
Right. And T release does not do that very often. It's only for like things that we absolutely need to get it building again, right? They're not making decisions for other teams.
Okay. Has there ever been a time where it's like something that needs to get done, but like nobody wants to do it because maybe too hard or they just don't want to do it? I don't know how to explain.
Nobody likes writing the release notes, I think, but that's what T release does. They like hand it off between themselves every 6 weeks, and someone new gets assigned each time. I don't think we've had problems with shipping a release in the past. I mean, other than, CI issues and that sort of thing, but not social issues.
Okay. Yeah, I could just imagine because sometimes like I want to be first when I have like the feature list. I'm like, all right, I'm grabbing this one, this one, this one. Good luck with those.
Yeah, so the train schedule we have makes it so that there's a bit less pressure here because if something doesn't make it into the current release, then it'll just ship in 6 weeks instead. Like it's not a 3-year cycle the way C++ does additions, it does new
Okay.
versions, right? There's not a high pressure to make it into this release instead of the next one.
Got it. Oh yeah, yeah. That is kind of nice about Rust. There's always the constant release, and it's like, well, if this is not ready, then we're just gonna rip it out or put it behind a feature.
Right.
Well,
Right.
that is nice. So now that you're on the new team, I mean, do people still come up to you and ask you stuff about docs? Like, oh, hey, I'm working on this. I got this problem. Can you?
Once in a while. Yeah, and I keep an eye on like the Zulip stream for Rustdoc. But I have tried to get people to take over some of the responsibilities I was doing. I have a couple people on the Rustdoc team who I was kind of mentoring before I left, and they've taken over those responsibilities, and that's been really nice.
So they're kind of like your Luke Skywalker, right? Just training them into all of the niceties of the stuff you built.
Right. I think mentoring and growing a team is one of the most important things anyone can
Yeah.
do, a Rust team, honestly. I mean, the work you individually do is definitely important, but enabling other people to do good work is even more important, in my opinion.
Oh yeah, this is true. I mean, for me, it's hard to let go of code that I wrote and like let somebody else kind of maintain it because you worry that they're not going to get the essence or all the stuff that you really put your heart into.
Right. They're going to make different decisions than you
And
would.
it's basically
Yeah.
your baby, right? You birthed that code, that feature. You want to make sure that it's going to be well taken care of, right? You never have that worry.
Right.
Do you go back and check up on it? Sorry,
Right.
go
That was
ahead.
a hard thing for me. What helped me adapt to it is I was like, would I rather have a decision that's like slightly different than I would make? Or would I rather have the decision be, 3 or 4 months later because I'm trying to do too much and I don't have the time? And I'm like, okay, I would rather go for something that's slightly different, but like still gets the feature and still gets it working. Right. And
Yeah.
that's kind of how I thought about it.
Now I'm just kind of curious, right? Because like I said, I feel like you and I are very similar in our working styles. Do you ever see something done and you're like, ooh, that's not very good. Oh, that could be better or something like that.
Yes. Yes. There have been times, even after I left the Rustdoc team, where I came back to a PR, I'm like, that's not right. You should change that. But I try not to do it too much because I don't want to undercut the current team lead or the people who are currently on the team.
Yeah. So how do you hold back? Maybe I'm looking for some advice for myself. How do you hold back from, not like you said, undercutting this kind of stuff?
A lot of the PRs I just don't look at. If I see something that wasn't in my part of Rustdoc or that looks innocuous or whatever, I just won't look at the PR. I'm like, okay, I trust the people who are there. If it's something that's like very relevant to the work I did before I left, like anything that touches queries or anything that touches separate AST for Rustdoc, I might glance over it. But unless I see something that's glaringly bad, I usually won't comment unless it's just a straight out approval. But if I see something that's obviously wrong, then I'll call out that.
Yeah. Like, I mean, one thing could be, oh, wait, you don't understand about these use cases that may come up. So this may be a problem, something like that, right?
Right, right. I do that a lot on the Zulip when I see people discussing things. As I'm like, this is why it works this way today. This is one thing you may want to think about. This is an existing issue that you might want to look at. That sort of thing.
Yeah, I think we've all seen code like I think there was this like famous code where it's got like a comment above it like if you like move this code up or down or call it later or before, then everything will go bad. So just leave it here. And you're like, there's always the
Right.
famous like, oh yeah, you know what? I can fix this. And then you try for days and you're like, you know what? There's a reason why it's there and commented and told not to touch it. It's like do
Have
not
you
touch, I
seen
think
the
I've seen.
Stack Overflow post where it's like, what's the worst code you've seen? And someone points to something at work and they're like, it's been 80 total engineer hours spent trying to fix this up. If you spend more time on it, update this comment so the next person knows not to try.
I think is this the one where it's like people actually leaving their names there? Like
Maybe.
has checked it. It sounds familiar, but maybe I'm dreaming. But
Maybe. Yeah, I remember seeing it. It was funny.
oh, okay. Yeah, somebody was. I was just it came up on Quora. I was just taking a look at it, and somebody said the worst code they've seen was the CSS scene with 90% importance. Okay, I don't know why it's so bad, but I guess because you can't override the width.
Yeah, I haven't worked with CSS a lot, but I think it like messes with the cascading part, cascading style sheet, something like that.
Yeah, it could be. In any case, so for your new team, right? Do you feel it's more suitable for you, or you're more enjoying it than Rustoc's before?
I think so. It's easier to make decisions about features, I think. Rustdoc is in kind of a weird position because everybody uses it and everybody has opinions on it. But also, a lot of the stuff is very subjective. So, for example, one of the features the team is currently working on is like, I want approved, sanctioned way to have warning pop ups in the documentation. So, I think Tokyo, for example, does this around something to do with runtime. So like make sure you don't do this thing because it won't work. And right now they have like some custom CSS they inject, and it's like a different style than the rest of Rustdoc uses because Rustdoc doesn't have a way to easily use the same style in user documentation. And the idea was, okay, well, let's add our own feature. And like the decision of how to add that feature is like annoying. There's like a lot of ways to do it, and none of them are clearly better than the others. And so, like, deciding on one is kind of annoying. And that kind of frustrated me when I was still on that team. Whereas for Bootstrap, I just talk to the people working on the compiler. I'm like, hey, would you like this? And they say yes, or they say no, that would break my workflow. And that's kind of easier for me, at least, to think about because it's not as complicated. There's not as many ways to implement the same thing.
So they never, or do they come to you and say, "I want this," or "This is broken"? No.
Sometimes I do see issues on the issue tracker and that sort of thing. But more often, I'll just observe people running into trouble. I'll be like, hey, that's something we can make better for the next person. On Zulip, especially, people will post an issue. I don't understand what's going wrong here. And they'll get help. There's other people on Zulip than me. But usually I'm the one who comes in afterwards and I'm like, hey, how could we prevent this problem from happening in the future? And that's how a lot of my work gets done.
Maybe it'd be interesting to hear the difference between what's a typical workday on Rustdoc and what's a typical workday on the bootstrapping of the compiler.
Yeah, I don't think typical workday necessarily is a thing for open source just because the
Yeah.
time I have in a given day is so variable. But the type of work I'm doing is definitely different between the two teams. For Rustdoc, it was mostly like refactors and that sort of thing, occasionally like trying to get consensus on a feature. Whereas for Bootstrap, it's a lot more like just hard technical problems, which I think I enjoy more.
And kind of observing what people are doing and what people complain about and then proposing features.
Right. And it's easier to see the users of Bootstrap too, right? Because I see them on Zulip, I see them complaining. Whereas people in Rustdoc, they're in private companies, their own discords, that sort of thing, and it's harder to get visibility into how people are using Rustdoc.
Mm.
You
Yeah, that's true. When you get these bug reports, you're like, why the heck? I'm sure you get this no matter what you're doing, right? Like you get this bug report and you're like, why the heck are you doing that like that? Or and sometimes it's like, well, they're just not doing it properly. And sometimes it's like, oh, I never even thought about that, or that's an interesting use case.
Yes, someone opened an issue a long time ago. They wanted to use intradoc links with markdown files, and they were passing, I think it was -L or something, the flag that Cargo passes to show the compiler where the dependencies are. And I never thought of doing that. I was like, oh, that's a great idea. We should definitely add that feature. And so, like, this idea that this person had was great, like the way to implement it.
Yeah, sometimes when you hear things from people who aren't in the code, you're like, oh, that's a fantastic idea. I never
Right,
thought about that. You need like fresh ideas, right? Sometimes.
right. Fresh eyes are always helpful.
Yeah.
Actually, one of the things, so I got a grant from the Rust Foundation work recently to improve the process of getting started with the compiler to make it easier to use the build system and the documentation, that sort of thing. And actually, the thing I proposed was have people use the build system, try and get started for the first time and see what it is that they have difficulty with. And then the thing that they have difficulty with, exactly the thing you want to fix. Like, you don't have to guess.
Well, how do you know which is the thing that they're having difficulties with? You just take a look at the common issues people are having.
No, so this is why I got a grant for it. Is I actually like sat down with people and I took
Oh,
video recording of their screen as they were working on the code, and I was like, "Oh yeah, that error there was not easy to read. We can improve that sort of thing."
oh, okay. Yeah, well, that's kind of the nice part is maybe that's the annoying thing is like the errors are a little bit too specific at times. You're like, oh, here's the error in code. You can copy this and figure out what it is that we're talking about and get a real deep dive into it.
Yeah, I think the problem for the compiler itself for Bootstrap is more that the errors are coming from kind of too low a level. So Bootstrap is a build orchestration tool. There's the Rust compiler at the bottom, Rust C. There's Cargo running the Rust compiler, and then there's Bootstrap running Cargo. And so there's kind of like a bunch of layers of indirection. And so an error that you see from the compiler might not necessarily make sense. So for example, if you want to see debug logging from the compiler, you've made a change, you want to test it out. You set rust clog equals info. You'll see by default a warning that says info logging is disabled, recompile with X feature to see logging. But there's not a way for you to configure that with Bootstrap. It's actually like something in config.toml that's like just a completely different name. And the mismatch between those two, I think, is usually what's tricky for people because, like, even though the error is correct, it's not an error that's useful to them.
Yeah, that part was always a little bit weird. Like Rust is not the only language that I know of that has this where it's like, okay, Rust C is the actual compiler, but you're usually interacting with Cargo when you build and do everything with. It just feels like weird. It's like, why the heck do we have a Rust C sometimes? But yeah, it really gets confusing for somebody who isn't in the weeds, as we call it, right?
Right. Yeah, so I actually know someone who worked on the compiler for a while called Eddie B, and they were like, yeah, I don't think we should ever have made Cargo and Rust C separate. They should just be the same program.
Yeah.
I don't know if I would go that far, but there's definitely a lot of things where it's like the mismatch between the two makes the errors you see a little less helpful, especially around cargo features. I think it can be hard to know like whether when an error you see is coming from a feature being disabled as opposed to a problem in your code.
Well, I mean, what I understand is like the Cargo basically will prepare everything for Rust C to do what it needs to
Mhm.
do. That's the way I kind of understand it and simplify it. I don't know if that's a good summary or not.
Yeah, that's a pretty good summary, I think. But it also does. I think the one that really trips people up is features, especially. So you can have cargo features. So, for example, Serday has a derive feature where you can, derive serialize, that sort of thing. And for a while, the error you would get if you tried to derive serialize and you didn't have the feature enabled was quite poor. It would say, this is a trait and not a derive macro or something like that. And that's because it's kind of happening at the wrong level, right? The error you want to see is enable this feature to use the macro. But the only error the compiler has enough information for is this is a trait and not a macro.
You know what? I think I ran into this one a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
It sounds familiar because I was like, how come I cannot use this derive macro?
Right, right. Like the error is correct, but it's not useful.
Yeah. That would be what I want as a new person because I'm like, why would you not have derived after I knew I had to enable it, I was like, why would you not enable this by default? This is what we need, right? This is what we always use. This is the power of Serde. But then it's like, well, it is adding more bloat and stuff. And if you don't have to have it, it's just a nice to have. It's like, okay,
Right.
fine. Now I get it. It's just not clear for me.
Yeah. There's a lot of things in Rust where I think the reason the way things are the way they are is not clear until you've been using them for a while. I'm trying to think of another example. Anyway, yeah.
I do have one last question. Maybe you don't have the answer for this because it's a little bit off topic. Like, whose idea was it to have like this cargo crates kind of theme for Rust? Because usually they're all related, right? Rust is like related to like metal and also actually originally the fungus. But then we have cargo, which is about containers and crates. And I guess that kind of makes sense, but there's not really related, I think.
I don't know. That's a great question. I think Alex Crichton was one of the first people to work on cargo, and maybe he would know. But yeah, I'm not sure.
I mean, because you Ruby's got Ruby gems. Okay, they're in the jewelry part, right? You got Python and eggs, and now of course they think they have something else, but at least
Oh
there
my
was
god,
something
I
there.
just got that the eggs thing. Okay. Okay.
Really?
Wow.
Well, that's what I'm guessing. At least it makes sense. But that was, I think, the original container. Now they got wheels now, but Python and wheels doesn't really make sense. But at least there was something at the beginning.
Right. Wow, that's so funny. Yeah, Python was actually my first programming language that I learned.
Well, you do know that Pipey should be called the. I think it is called the cheese factory, right? A lot of
Yeah,
people
they
don't know
have
that.
something in their docs about cheese. Yeah.
Because you never really thought about it, but it's all about from Monty Python, and they have something about there's a cheese factory skit.
Right,
So
right, right.
everything's still framed around Monty Python, which is interesting. Yeah, I wish I could understand that part. Maybe I need to. So it's Alex Crichton, is that right?
Alex Crichton. Yeah, I can spell it for
Crichton.
you. Chriscton. He works at Fastly now, I think. Most of them was him.
Okay. Yeah, I might need to bug him and ask him to come on the show and talk about what's the relation. I don't get it.
Right.
Maybe it's just like, uh, we needed something to call our libraries, and crates just sound nice. Cool. Yeah, I mean, is there anything you want to shout out or anything you want to say before we sign off? I think we're approaching the end of our time.
I think that's the big one. I'll give a shout out to my Rustcraft talk, I guess. It has a whole lot more detail about how Bootstrap works and what's involved with that process and how to get involved. If you look up, I think bootstrapping the once and future compiler is what I called it. I thought it was a very clever pun, and in retrospect, I don't think anyone got it, but that's okay.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. I see it over here. Back in September, it was published on YouTube.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, cool. Thank you for that. And thanks for coming on. And yeah, I'm happy that you're a healthier person, at least mentally, from, trying something new and taking some time off. It's something we all need to do. And people should not be afraid of doing that.
Thank you, Alan. It's been great chatting.
Awesome.